Ma'am, step out immediately, or you're under arrest for criminal trespassing.
I stood frozen as 4 police officers ordered my wife Sarah to leave our own home, while she held our crying 6-year-old daughter close. Behind them stood HOA President Margaret Thornfield, the neighborhood tyrant who'd tormented us for years. She smirked and sneered,
"Maybe now you people will finally learn respect for your betters."
Rage surged through me. Just as I was about to explode, Sarah calmly reached into her purse and handed the lead officer a small card. His eyes widened. He turned sharply to Margaret. "Ma'am, stand back."
This property is under federal protection.
Her smirk vanished instantly. Her face went pale. She had no idea she was trying to evict a military family from base-affiliated housing, and that card carried the full weight of federal law. I'm Derek Hawkins, and what happened next was pure karma. Where are you watching from? This story proves bullies don't always win. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare. I'm Major Derek Hawkins, stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and my family lives in Meadowbrook Gardens, a civilian housing development right outside the base gates. It's one of those places where military families can live off base while still maintaining easy access to the installation. For 3 years, we'd been dealing with Margaret Thornfield's reign of terror. Picture this woman, 62 years old, driving her pristine white Lexus through our neighborhood like she's patrolling enemy territory. The smell of her vanilla air freshener couldn't mask the bitterness that had consumed her since her husband left her for a younger woman. Margaret had turned HOA management into a personal vendetta against anyone who didn't meet her impossible standards. But her favorite targets? Military families. She seemed to take special pleasure in harassing people who served their country. My wife Sarah works as a federal court clerk at the nearby courthouse, processing cases for federal judges and maintaining security clearance that requires extensive background checks. She's organized, methodical, and knows federal law better than most lawyers. Our daughter Emma just turned 6, loves her swing set, and has no idea why the mean lady in the white car always stares at our house. Margaret's harassment campaign against us started small. Citations for grass being half an inch too tall, complaints about Emma's chalk drawings on our own driveway, demands that we remove the small American flag from our front porch because it wasn't regulation size according to HOA bylaws. But Margaret's real issue wasn't grass height or flag size. It was what Sarah represented. See, our housing development has a special relationship with Aberdeen Proving Ground. Military families get housing allowances that help us afford homes in this area, and we're covered under federal housing protections that supersede local HOA rules. Margaret either didn't know about these protections, or she thought she could intimidate us into compliance anyway. The escalation was systematic and cruel. Margaret would time her inspections for when I was on duty, thinking Sarah was an easier target. She'd knock on our door during Emma's nap time, demanding to discuss violations that didn't exist. She'd leave threatening notes about maintaining community standards and respecting the established order. The final straw came last Tuesday. Sarah was getting Emma ready for school when Margaret appeared at our door with an official-looking document. She claimed that military families were temporary residents with no permanent standing in the community, and therefore subject to immediate eviction if they failed to maintain appropriate respect for HOA authority. The document was completely bogus, but it looked official enough to scare most people. Margaret had typed it on HOA letterhead and included references to Maryland housing law that were either misquoted or completely fabricated. But Margaret made one critical error. She hand-delivered this fake eviction notice while I was home getting ready for work. I watched through our kitchen window as she spoke to Sarah on the front porch, saw my wife's face go pale as she read Margaret's document, heard my daughter ask why Mommy looked scared. That's when I made the call that would end Margaret's harassment campaign forever. I didn't call my commanding officer or base legal services. I called 911 and reported that someone was attempting to illegally evict a military family using fraudulent documents. I wanted this confrontation handled by civilian police, so Margaret couldn't claim this was military interference in civilian affairs. What I didn't expect was for Margaret to convince the responding officers that we were the problem. By the time 4 patrol cars arrived, she'd spun a story about dangerous squatters who were threatening community safety and needed immediate removal. Standing in my own driveway, watching police officers tell my wife to leave our home while my daughter cried behind her legs, I realized Margaret Thornfield had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was bullying a helpless military family. She had no idea she was about to face the full power of federal law. The first confrontation with Margaret happened 6 months ago, and it should have been my warning about how far this woman was willing to go. I was mowing our front lawn on a Saturday morning when Margaret's white Lexus pulled into our driveway. She stepped out wearing what I can only describe as her official HOA business outfit, a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance and an expression like she was about to foreclose on our mortgage. "Mr. Hawkins, we need to discuss your family's ongoing violations of community standards." I shut off the mower and wiped sweat from my forehead. The August heat was already brutal at 9 a.m., and the smell of fresh-cut grass hung heavy in the humid air. "What violations, Mrs. Thornfield?" She pulled out a clipboard thick with papers and began reading like she was delivering a legal indictment. "Excessive noise from children's outdoor activities between the hours of 7 and 9 a.m. Unauthorized decorative items displayed on front porch. Failure to maintain regulation hedge height on eastern property boundary." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're complaining about my 6-year-old playing outside our American flag and bushes that are maybe 2 inches taller than some arbitrary standard?" "Military families," Margaret said with a tone that made my jaw clench, "need to understand that federal housing allowances don't exempt you from civilian community standards. This isn't base housing where you can do whatever you want." That's when I realized Margaret's real problem wasn't with our hedge height. It was with us getting federal housing assistance that helped military families afford homes in her precious neighborhood. But Margaret's first major escalation came 2 weeks later, and it showed me exactly how vindictive she could be. Sarah had taken Emma to the community playground after dinner, something they did every evening. Emma loved the swings, and Sarah enjoyed the few minutes of peace while our daughter played safely within the fenced area. Margaret appeared like a storm cloud on the horizon, marching across the playground with her clipboard and a measuring tape. She began documenting the exact times Sarah and Emma were using the equipment, taking photos of Emma on the swings, and making notes about unauthorized extended use of community resources. "Excuse me," Margaret announced loudly enough for 3 other families to hear. "Playground use is limited to 30 minutes per family per day. You've been here for 37 minutes. Sarah looked around at the empty playground. There were 8 pieces of equipment and exactly 1 other child using them. "Mrs. Thornfield, there's no one waiting to use the swings." "Rules are rules," Margaret snapped. "Military families don't get special privileges just because they think they're serving their country." Emma stopped swinging and looked confused. At 6 years old, she couldn't understand why the mean lady was yelling at her mommy for letting her play. Sarah's response was calm but firm. "Mrs. Thornfield, I work for federal courts. I know the difference between legitimate community rules and harassment. There's no 30-minute limit posted anywhere, and even if there was, it wouldn't be enforceable with an empty playground." That's when Margaret made her first serious mistake. She got close to Sarah's face and said, "Maybe you need to learn that federal employees aren't above community standards. I have authority here, not you." Sarah's federal court training kicked in. She recognized Margaret's statement as what prosecutors call abuse of authority under color of law, using official position to harass someone based on their federal employment status. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah had been quietly documenting every interaction, every bogus violation notice, every harassment incident in a detailed log that would become crucial evidence later. But Margaret's mini twist came the next day, when she filed a formal complaint with base security, claiming that Sarah had threatened violence against civilian community leaders during the playground confrontation. The complaint was complete fabrication, but it triggered an automatic investigation that required me to meet with base security officers and provide statements about my family's off-base activities. Sitting in that sterile security office, answering questions about whether my wife had threatened an HOA president, I realized Margaret Thornfield was waging systematic warfare against my family. She wasn't just being petty, she was actively trying to damage my military career by creating false reports that suggested my family posed security risks. That night, I made a decision that would eventually destroy Margaret completely. Instead of filing a counter-complaint or trying to handle this through military channels, I began researching federal laws that protect military families from civilian harassment. What I discovered was that Margaret had unknowingly stepped into a legal minefield. Federal housing protections for military families aren't suggestions. They're laws with serious criminal penalties for violations. Margaret thought she was teaching us a lesson about community respect. Actually, she was providing federal prosecutors with evidence of systematic civil rights violations. Margaret's second wave came during Emma's birthday planning, and it showed me exactly how vindictive she'd become when her harassment tactics weren't working. 2 weeks after base security dismissed her false complaint, Margaret launched what she called a community education campaign about military families in civilian housing. The first sign of trouble came when Mrs. Patterson knocked on our door Tuesday evening, looking embarrassed and holding a printed flyer. "Sarah, honey, I need to show you what that woman is distributing to neighbors. I don't believe any of this nonsense." The flyer was titled "Military Housing Facts for Civilian Communities" and contained information that ranged from misleading to completely false. According to Margaret's research, military families received excessive government subsidies that gave them unfair advantages over civilian homeowners. The document claimed that basic allowance for housing was taxpayer-funded special treatment that allowed military families to outbid civilian families for quality housing. It suggested that military families were temporary residents with no long-term investment in community values. But Margaret's most damaging lie was about security risks. She claimed that military families attracted unwanted government attention that could compromise neighborhood privacy and safety. Sarah read the flyer twice, her face growing pale. "Derek, she's trying to turn our neighbors against military families by spreading misinformation about federal housing benefits." Margaret's campaign was systematic. She'd visited 12 houses over 3 days, presenting her research about military housing issues and asking neighbors to sign a petition supporting residential stability through demographic consistency. The petition language was carefully crafted to sound reasonable while actually requesting discrimination against military families. It asked for priority consideration for permanent residents and enhanced screening of temporary government-subsidized renters. Here's what Margaret didn't understand. Discriminating against military families in civilian housing violates both SKRA and Fair Housing Act protections. Her petition was documenting federal civil rights violations in writing, but Margaret's mini twist revealed how far her delusions had progressed. 3 neighbors who signed Margaret's petition called us directly to apologize after researching military housing rights online. They'd discovered that BAH isn't special treatment. It's compensation for military families who can't live in base housing due to space limitations. Mr. Johnson was particularly angry. "Margaret told me military families got free housing that regular people couldn't access. When I looked it up, I learned BAH is just salary adjustment for housing costs. She lied to make me sign that petition." Mrs. Bellamy had a similar reaction. Margaret said military families were security risks because of government connections. "My husband works for the Postal Service. Are federal employees supposed to be unwelcome in civilian neighborhoods?" Margaret's misinformation campaign was backfiring as neighbors educated themselves about military housing and discovered she'd been lying about federal benefits and legal requirements. But her most serious escalation came Thursday morning when Sarah discovered all 4 tires on her car had been slashed in our driveway overnight. The damage was clearly intentional, deep cuts in the sidewalls that made the tires completely unusable. Sarah called me immediately, and I could hear the stress in her voice as she described finding our car vandalized. "Derek, this isn't random. Someone used a knife to destroy every tire systematically. This is escalation." I called Aberdeen Proving Grounds Security Office first, then civilian police. Vandalism of military family property near base installations gets taken seriously because it could indicate targeting of service members. The responding officer, Sergeant Morrison, documented the damage thoroughly and asked routine questions about potential suspects. When I mentioned our ongoing harassment situation with Margaret, his attention sharpened. "Mr. Hawkins, has this HOA president made specific threats against your property or family?" I showed Sergeant Morrison Sarah's documentation of Margaret's harassment campaign, including the false complaints and discriminatory petition. When he read Margaret's statements about military families being temporary residents who should respect permanent residents, his expression became professionally serious. "Sir, what you're describing sounds like possible bias-motivated crime. Targeting military families specifically could qualify as hate crime enhancement under Maryland law." But Margaret's biggest mistake came when Sergeant Morrison was still documenting the vandalism. She appeared across the street, apparently walking her small dog, and approached our driveway with what looked like genuine concern. "Oh my goodness, what happened to your car? This is exactly the kind of problem I've been warning neighbors about. When communities accept transient populations, it attracts criminal elements." Sergeant Morrison looked at Margaret with obvious suspicion. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that military families attract crime to neighborhoods?" Margaret, apparently not realizing she was talking to a police officer investigating crime against military family property, continued her discriminatory comments. "I'm just saying that when you have people with weapons training and connections to dangerous overseas activities, sometimes it creates an environment that encourages violence." Sergeant Morrison's response was immediate and professional. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification. You're describing military service members as criminal threats while I'm investigating vandalism against military family property." Margaret's face went white when she realized she'd just made discriminatory statements about military families to a police officer investigating possible bias crime against those same families. The tire slashing investigation became Margaret's downfall, but she was too arrogant to realize how much evidence she was providing against herself. Sergeant Morrison's investigation was thorough and professional. He reviewed security camera footage from neighbors' houses, documented the systematic nature of the vandalism, and most importantly, researched Margaret's background after her suspicious comments about military families. What he discovered was a pattern that prosecutors love: documented harassment escalating to property destruction with clear bias motivation. Margaret had filed 11 complaints with various county offices over 6 months, all targeting military families in our neighborhood. Code enforcement, noise violations, parking infractions. Every complaint was against families receiving BAH, and every allegation had been investigated and dismissed as unfounded. But Margaret's mini twist came when she overplayed her hand with the tire slashing investigation. 2 days after the vandalism, Margaret called Sergeant Morrison claiming she had additional security information about our family that might explain why we were targeted for crime. The phone call, which Sergeant Morrison recorded as part of his investigation, was Margaret's biggest mistake yet. "Officer, I need you to understand that this military family has been causing problems in our community for months. The husband has access to dangerous equipment through his base position, and the wife maintains suspicious contacts through her federal court job." Sergeant Morrison let Margaret talk long enough to thoroughly document her discriminatory statements. These people think military service gives them special rights to disrupt civilian neighborhoods. When you combine weapons access with an attitude of superiority, it creates the kind of environment that attracts criminal attention. Margaret continued, "I'm not saying they vandalize their own car for sympathy, but military families do have training in deception and psychological operations." That recorded statement became what prosecutors call clear evidence of bias motivation. Margaret had just accused military families of staging crimes against themselves while suggesting that military service made people inherently dangerous and deceptive. Sergeant Morrison's follow-up investigation was swift and decisive. He obtained search warrants for Margaret's property and discovered exactly what he expected: tools consistent with tire damage, plus a detailed journal documenting her surveillance of military families in the neighborhood. Margaret's journal was devastating evidence of premeditation and bias. Entries included observations about our daily routines, notes about when military families were most vulnerable to harassment, and explicit statements about her goal to remove government-subsidized residents from the community. One journal entry read, "Military wives are easier targets when husbands are on duty. They're trained to be dependent and submissive, so consistent pressure will make them recommend relocation to avoid continued conflict." Another entry revealed Margaret's financial motivation. Property values increase when temporary government renters are replaced by permanent civilian homeowners. HOA consulting fees from property management companies justify community improvement efforts. Margaret was documenting herself as someone who vandalized military family property as part of a systematic campaign to drive service members out of civilian housing for financial gain. But her most damaging escalation came when she tried to manipulate the criminal investigation through false reporting. 3 days after police found her journal, Margaret called Child Protective Services claiming that our family was exposing a child to dangerous situations through involvement in criminal activities and association with unstable individuals. The CPS complaint alleged that Emma was being traumatized by her parents' conflicts with community leaders, and that Sarah was neglecting child welfare by maintaining employment that attracts criminal attention. And every allegation was designed to suggest that our family's problems with Margaret were actually evidence of parental unfitness and child endangerment. The CPS investigator, Patricia Williams, was experienced enough to recognize false reporting when she saw it. Margaret's complaint contained specific details that suggested personal knowledge rather than legitimate child welfare concern. Mrs. Hawkins, Patricia said after completing her assessment, this complaint appears to be harassment disguised as child welfare reporting. The allegations don't match what I observe, and the reporting pattern suggests retaliation rather than genuine concern. Sarah handed Patricia the same documentation she'd been maintaining for months: systematic evidence of Margaret's harassment campaign, discriminatory statements, and now criminal property destruction. Patricia Williams reviewed the evidence with obvious professional interest. Mrs. Hawkins, false CPS reporting is a felony in Maryland, especially when it's part of documented harassment against protected classes. I'm required to report this to appropriate authorities. Margaret's escalation from harassment to vandalism to false governmental reporting had transformed neighborhood drama into multiple felonies with clear bias motivation. But her final mistake in this phase showed how completely disconnected from reality she'd become. That evening, Margaret appeared at our front door with what she called a final settlement offer to resolve our mutual misunderstanding. She proposed that our family voluntarily relocate within 60 days, and in exchange, she would recommend dismissal of the criminal charges against her and ensure positive references for our next housing application. Margaret was attempting to negotiate her way out of criminal charges by offering to stop committing crimes if we abandoned our legal rights. Sarah's response was perfect. Mrs. Thornfield, you're under investigation for bias-motivated vandalism and false reporting. You can't negotiate away criminal charges, and we're not relocating because of your criminal behavior. Margaret's harassment campaign had evolved into multiple felonies, and she still believed she had enough power to negotiate outcomes rather than face legal consequences. The turning point came when Captain Jennifer Martinez from Aberdeen Proving Grounds Legal Assistance Office called me with information that changed our entire approach to Margaret's harassment. Major Hawkins, I've reviewed your documentation and consulted with Base Command about civilian harassment of military families. What you're experiencing isn't just individual criminal behavior, it's systematic violation of federal law. Captain Martinez explained that Margaret's campaign against our family triggered multiple federal protections that most civilians don't understand. The Service Members Civil Relief Act doesn't just prevent evictions. It prohibits any civilian attempts to harass, intimidate, or discriminate against military families based on their service status. The statements you've recorded about military families being temporary residents and government-subsidized renters constitute clear evidence of SCRA violations. This isn't neighborhood drama anymore. It's federal civil rights violation. But the real revelation came when Captain Martinez shared research she'd conducted about Margaret's background and activities in other communities. Major, your HOA president has a history of targeting military families. I contacted legal assistance offices at 3 other installations and found similar complaints about Margaret Thornfield's harassment tactics. The pattern was systematic and deliberate. Margaret had served on HOA boards near military installations in Virginia and North Carolina, and in each location she'd focused on harassing military families until they relocated. Her tactics were consistent: escalating fines for fabricated violations, false complaints to various authorities, discriminatory petitions targeting temporary government-subsidized renters, and property vandalism when other methods failed to achieve voluntary relocation. What makes this federal case, Captain Martinez continued, is that Margaret is using HOA authority to systematically violate military families' housing rights across multiple states. This isn't isolated harassment, it's organized discrimination. Here's what most people don't understand about SCRA violations: they carry both criminal penalties and civil liability that can financially destroy the perpetrators. Margaret wasn't just facing local criminal charges. She was exposed to federal civil rights lawsuits that could result in massive damage awards. Captain Martinez's most important revelation was about Sarah's role as a federal court clerk. Mrs. Hawkins' federal employment status provides additional protections under federal employee harassment statutes. Targeting federal workers for their government positions violates specific federal laws with serious penalties. The combination of SCRA protections for military families and federal employee protection statutes for Sarah created what prosecutors call enhanced liability for anyone targeting our family based on our federal service. But Captain Martinez's final piece of information was the game changer. Major, Base Command is authorizing full legal assistance for your family's case against Margaret Thornfield. We're treating this as precedent-setting for military family protection in civilian housing. Aberdeen. Proving Ground's commanding officer had decided that Margaret's systematic harassment of military families near base installations required institutional response to protect all service members in civilian housing. The base legal office would provide attorneys, investigators, and expert witnesses for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation against Margaret. Military legal assistance would coordinate with civilian prosecutors to ensure maximum penalties for SCRA violations. Additionally, Captain Martinez explained, Base Command is implementing new protocols for supporting military families facing civilian harassment. Your case will become training material for military legal assistance offices nationwide. What started as neighborhood harassment had become a federal case with implications for military family protection policies across all service branches. Sarah's systematic documentation of Margaret's harassment wasn't just evidence for local prosecution. It was becoming the foundation for enhanced federal protections for military families facing civilian discrimination. Margaret thought she was targeting one vulnerable military family. Actually, she'd declared war on federal institutions that protect service members and their families from exactly the kind of systematic harassment she specialized in. The midpoint revelation wasn't just about legal protections. It was about institutional response. When civilians target military families for their service status, the entire federal system responds to protect people who protect America. Margaret's harassment campaign was about to face the full weight of military legal assistance, federal prosecution, and civil rights enforcement that she never imagined existed. Federal law doesn't just protect military families. It punishes people who violate those protections with consequences that destroy lives and finances permanently. Our strategy shifted from defensive to offensive once we understood the full scope of Margaret's legal exposure and our federal protections. This wasn't just about stopping her harassment anymore. It was about creating precedent for military family protection in civilian housing. Captain Martinez coordinated our legal response with the precision of a military operation. Aberdeen Proving Grounds Legal Assistance Office assigned Staff Judge Advocate Major Rebecca Bellamy to handle our case, bringing serious military legal firepower to what Margaret probably thought was a neighborhood dispute. Major Hawkins, Major Bellamy explained during our first strategy meeting, your family's case represents exactly why SCRA exists. We're going to use every available legal tool to ensure Margaret Thornfield never targets another military family. The documentation phase was systematic and thorough. Sarah's months of recording Margaret's statements, photographing bogus violation notices, and maintaining detailed timeline evidence became the foundation for multiple legal actions. But Major Bellamy's first strategic move was expanding our evidence beyond Margaret's direct harassment. Military legal assistance has resources that civilian families can't access, including coordination with other base legal offices and federal law enforcement databases. We've contacted legal assistance offices at Fort Belvoir, Camp Lejeune, and Norfolk Naval Base, Major Bellamy reported. Margaret Thornfield has harassment complaints filed against her at all three locations, targeting military families with identical tactics. The multi-state pattern elevated our case from isolated harassment to systematic civil rights violations. Federal prosecutors pay special attention to defendants who target protected classes across multiple jurisdictions. Our planning included coordination with civilian authorities who were building criminal cases against Margaret for property vandalism and false reporting. The combination of civilian criminal charges and federal civil rights violations created what prosecutors call comprehensive accountability. Here's something most people don't know about military legal assistance. It includes access to federal investigators, expert witnesses, and specialized prosecutors who understand military family issues. Translation: when you target military families, you're not just fighting individual victims, you're fighting institutional legal resources. Major Bellamy's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. We would file simultaneous actions that attacked Margaret's harassment from every possible legal angle: criminal prosecution for vandalism and false reporting through civilian courts, federal civil rights lawsuit for SCRA violations and discrimination against military families, administrative complaint against HOA board for violating fair housing laws, professional misconduct complaint against Margaret's property management consulting business. Each legal action would reinforce the others, creating cascading consequences that would destroy Margaret's ability to continue harassing military families anywhere. The timeline was carefully coordinated. Criminal charges would be filed first, creating public record of Margaret's criminal behavior. Federal civil rights lawsuit would follow, using criminal conviction as evidence of bias motivation. Administrative and professional complaints would complete Margaret's destruction by eliminating her authority and income sources. Sarah's role evolved from victim to expert witness. Her federal court experience made her invaluable for preparing legal documents, organizing evidence, and understanding procedural requirements that might confuse civilian families. "Mrs. Hawkins," Major Bellamy explained, "your documentation and legal knowledge have created the strongest SCRA violation case I've seen. Federal prosecutors call this textbook evidence of systematic military family harassment. My preparation focused on military testimony and base coordination. Aberdeen Proving Grounds commanding officer wanted clear documentation of Margaret's impact on military family morale and base community relations. The base's approach was comprehensive. Margaret's harassment of military families near base installations was treated as attack on military readiness and family welfare. Base Command authorized full institutional support for prosecuting civilians who target service members. But our most effective preparation was community education and coalition building. Major Bellamy arranged for base legal assistance to present SCRA training to our entire housing development. 43 families attended the presentation about military family rights in civilian housing. The community response was immediate and supportive. Neighbors who'd signed Margaret's discriminatory petitions publicly apologized after learning about federal protections for military families. Property management companies began implementing policies to prevent harassment of service members. Mrs. Patterson organized a neighborhood support committee for military families. Mr. Johnson started researching HOA board recall procedures. The Bellamys began documenting other families Margaret had harassed. Margaret's isolation became complete as community members educated themselves about military family rights and realized they'd been manipulated into supporting illegal discrimination. The final preparation element was media coordination. Base Public Affairs worked with local newspapers to ensure accurate reporting about military family protections and civilian legal obligations under federal law. This case will become educational for other communities, Major Bellamy concluded. Military families need to understand their SCRA rights, and civilian authorities need to understand the consequences of violating those rights. Our preparation transformed Margaret's harassment campaign into comprehensive legal action that would protect military families regionally while destroying her personally, professionally, and financially. Margaret thought she was fighting one military family. Actually, she was about to face coordinated legal action from military legal assistants, federal prosecutors, civilian courts, and community members who refused to tolerate discrimination against service members. Margaret's desperation became visible as our legal strategy gained momentum and her community support evaporated. Instead of backing down, she doubled down with increasingly reckless behavior that provided even more evidence for our case. Her first desperate move came after she learned about the SCRA presentation at our community center. Margaret apparently realized that educated neighbors wouldn't support her anti-military harassment anymore, so she tried recruiting support from outside our neighborhood. I discovered this when Mrs. Patterson showed me a flyer Margaret was distributing at other HOA communities within a 20-mile radius. The document was titled Military Housing Invasion: Protecting Civilian Communities from Government Takeover. Margaret's flyer claimed that military families were part of a federal strategy to infiltrate and control civilian housing markets, using taxpayer-funded housing allowances to outcompete civilian families for quality homes. The misinformation was systematic and deliberate. Margaret portrayed BAH as special government privileges rather than basic military compensation. She described military families as temporary occupants with no community investment, who damaged property values through transient behavior. But Margaret's most dangerous lie was about security. She claimed military families attracted federal surveillance that violated civilian privacy rights and brought government monitoring to private communities. Sarah reviewed Margaret's propaganda with professional disgust. Derek, she's trying to spread anti-military sentiment to other communities. This isn't just harassment anymore, it's organized discrimination campaign. Major Bellamy's response was swift and decisive. This regional campaign transforms Margaret's harassment into federal civil rights violation with enhanced penalties. She's now demonstrating systematic targeting of military families across multiple communities. But Margaret's mini twist revealed how completely she'd lost touch with reality. 3 other HOA boards in our county received Margaret's anti-military literature and immediately contacted Aberdeen Proving Ground to report the discriminatory campaign. Instead of finding support, Margaret had alerted military legal assistance about her expanded targeting of service members. Community relations officers from Aberdeen visited each HOA board that received Margaret's propaganda, providing education about military family rights and federal protections under SCRA. Margaret's recruitment effort became education opportunity about consequences for harassing service members. Her second desperate escalation came when Margaret tried to manipulate the criminal investigation into her tire slashing. She called Sergeant Morrison claiming she had new evidence about the vandalism that would clear up misunderstandings about her involvement. Margaret apparently believed she could talk her way out of criminal charges by providing alternative theories about who damaged our property. The phone call, which Sergeant Morrison recorded, was Margaret's confession to criminal behavior. "Officer, I need you to understand that my actions were defensive, not criminal. When military families refuse to respect civilian community standards, sometimes property owners have to take protective measures." Margaret continued, "I didn't set out to damage their vehicle, but when people use federal employment to avoid accountability, sometimes escalation becomes necessary to maintain neighborhood stability." Sergeant Morrison let Margaret talk long enough to provide what prosecutors call clear admission of guilt with bias motivation. She'd just confessed to vandalizing military family property because of our federal service status. "Ma'am," Sergeant Morrison finally interrupted, "you're confessing to bias-motivated property destruction. I'm required to advise you that anything you say can be used against you in criminal prosecution." Margaret's response showed her complete disconnect from legal reality. You can't prosecute community leaders for protecting neighborhood values from government interference. Local authority supersedes federal employee privileges. That statement became evidence that Margaret believed her HOA position gave her immunity from criminal prosecution for targeting military families, exactly the kind of authority under color of law that federal civil rights statutes specifically prohibit. Margaret's final desperate move in this phase was attempting to rally political support for her anti-military campaign. She contacted our county commissioner's office claiming that Aberdeen Proving Ground was enabling harassment of civilian communities by supporting military families who disrespect local authority. Margaret requested a public hearing about military family accountability and federal interference in civilian housing management. She apparently believed that political pressure could force military families to accept harassment rather than invoke federal protections. The county commissioner's response was immediate and decisive. Commissioner Patricia Davis had served in the Army Reserve for 15 years and understood both military family issues and SCRA requirements. "Ms. Thornfield, what you're describing constitutes civil rights violations against military families. This office supports service members and will not participate in discrimination against people who defend our country." Commissioner Davis immediately contacted Base Community Relations and offered county support for any legal action protecting military families from civilian harassment. Margaret's attempt to gain political support became institutional backing for our legal case and public condemnation of her discriminatory campaign. Every desperate escalation provided more evidence while destroying any remaining support for her anti-military harassment. Margaret was building the case against herself while thinking she was fighting back against federal authority. Margaret's final escalation came when she realized that legal action, community pressure, and institutional opposition weren't going to stop. Instead of accepting consequences for her harassment campaign, she made one last desperate attempt to destroy our family through the most vicious method she could imagine. Her final attack targeted Emma directly. Monday morning, Margaret called Emma's elementary school and claimed she had urgent child safety information about our family that required immediate intervention. Margaret told the school principal that Sarah was neglecting child welfare by exposing the child to dangerous situations and using the child as leverage in conflicts with community leaders. She claimed Emma was traumatized by her parents' criminal behavior and needed emergency protective services. The school call wasn't random harassment. It was calculated assault designed to trigger Child Protective Services investigation that would destroy our family even if Margaret faced criminal consequences. Principal Sandra Williams had worked with military families for 20 years and immediately recognized Margaret's report as harassment rather than legitimate child welfare concern. Instead of automatically involving CPS, she called me directly. "Major Hawkins, we received a very concerning call about Emma's welfare. The caller made specific accusations that don't match our observations of your daughter or family. I think you should know about this immediately." When Principal Williams described Margaret's allegations, I realized this was Margaret's most dangerous escalation yet. False CPS reports can destroy military careers, cause loss of security clearance, and traumatize children even when investigations conclude the allegations are unfounded. "Ma'am, the person making these accusations has been criminally harassing our family for months. This is retaliation for our legal action against her." Principal Williams' response was professionally decisive. "Major Hawkins, I'm required to report suspected child abuse, but I'm also required to report false allegations that target specific families. This appears to be the latter." Margaret's mini-twist revealed her complete break from reality. She followed up the school call with a written complaint to Child Protective Services, claiming that Emma was being systematically abused through exposure to parental criminal activities and indoctrination into anti-community attitudes. Margaret's written CPS complaint was her most damaging self-incrimination yet. The document contained specific details about our family's daily routines, Emma's school schedule, and our property layout that could only come from systematic surveillance. CPS investigator Patricia Williams reviewed Margaret's complaint and immediately recognized it as false reporting. The allegations contained contradictory timelines, impossible logistics, and information that suggested personal vendetta rather than child welfare concern. "Mrs. Hawkins," Patricia explained during her required home visit, "this complaint appears to be harassment disguised as child protection. The reporting pattern and specific details suggest retaliation rather than genuine concern about Emma's welfare." Sarah handed Patricia the comprehensive documentation we'd been maintaining. Margaret's criminal charges, her recorded discriminatory statements, evidence of systematic harassment, and now her targeting of our daughter. Patricia Williams reviewed the evidence with obvious professional anger. 20 years of child protection work had taught her to recognize false reports, and Margaret's complaint was textbook harassment disguised as child welfare concern. "Mrs. Hawkins, false CPS reporting is a felony in Maryland, especially when it's part of documented harassment campaign against protected families. I'm not just closing this case, I'm referring it for prosecution." But Margaret's most revealing mistake came when Patricia Williams called to inform her that the CPS investigation had been closed and referred for false reporting prosecution. Margaret's response, which Patricia recorded as part of her documentation, was a complete confession to using child welfare system as weapon against military families. That child is being raised by parents who think federal employment gives them special rights in civilian communities. If CPS won't protect children from military family arrogance, then civilian communities have to find other ways to maintain standards. Margaret continued, "Military families who refuse to respect local authority shouldn't be allowed to raise children in civilian neighborhoods. Someone needs to protect communities from government employee attitudes." Patricia Williams had never heard such clear evidence of bias-motivated false reporting. Margaret was explicitly stating that she filed false child abuse allegations because of our military and federal employment status. Major Bellamy's reaction to Margaret's CPS attack was swift and comprehensive. Targeting military children through false abuse allegations represents the most serious escalation possible. Federal prosecutors treat attacks on military families' children as enhanced civil rights violations. Margaret's final escalation had transformed our harassment case into federal child endangerment charges with potential decades of prison time. Using government agencies to attack military children carries penalties that federal prosecutors pursue aggressively. Emma, thankfully, remained unaware of Margaret's attempt to destroy our family through false child abuse allegations. She continued playing with neighborhood friends, attending school normally, and looking forward to her upcoming birthday party. But Margaret's attack on our daughter was the final evidence federal prosecutors needed to seek maximum penalties under enhanced SCRA violations and federal child protection statutes. Margaret thought targeting Emma would force our family to withdraw legal action to protect our daughter. Actually, she'd provided evidence that would send her to federal prison for attacking military families' children. The community meeting that ended Margaret Thornfield's reign of terror wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a methodical presentation of evidence that destroyed her credibility completely while educating our neighbors about military family rights. Aberdeen Proving Grounds commanding officer Colonel Patricia Hayes had requested the meeting to address civilian harassment of military families and ensure community understanding of federal protections under SCRA. The Meadowbrook Gardens Community Center was packed. 53 residents attended, including several military families from other neighborhoods who'd driven hours to share their experiences with Margaret's harassment tactics. Local news crews covered the meeting after learning about Margaret's federal charges and systematic targeting of military families. County Commissioner Patricia Davis attended to demonstrate official support for service members facing civilian discrimination. But the most important attendee was Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Kim, who would present the federal government's case against Margaret to our entire community. Colonel Hayes opened the meeting with military directness. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you'll learn about systematic civil rights violations that have been committed against military families in your community. These violations represent serious federal crimes with severe penalties. Attorney Kim's presentation was methodical and devastating. She displayed Margaret's criminal charges on a large screen: bias-motivated vandalism, false police reporting, false child abuse allegations, systematic harassment of federal employees, and SCRA violations. Margaret Thornfield committed 14 separate felonies over 8 months, all targeting military families based on their service status. This wasn't neighborhood drama, it was organized discrimination against people who serve our country. The evidence presentation was comprehensive and damning. Attorney Kim showed Margaret's recorded statements about military families being temporary residents and government-subsidized renters. She displayed Margaret's anti-military propaganda distributed to other communities, but the most shocking evidence was Margaret's systematic targeting pattern across multiple states. Margaret Thornfield has harassed military families near Fort Belvoir, Camp Lejeune, Norfolk Naval Base, and Aberdeen Proving Ground. Her tactics are identical: escalating fines, false complaints, property vandalism, and false reporting to government agencies. The room's reaction was audible gasps and angry murmurs. Neighbors who'd watched Margaret target our family were learning they'd witnessed federal crimes against multiple military families. Mrs. Patterson stood first, her voice shaking with anger. "That woman convinced me to sign petitions against military families. She told me they were damaging property values. I had no idea she was recruiting me for discrimination." Mr. Johnson's response was equally emotional. "Margaret approached me about protecting our community from military invasion. She made military service sound like a threat to civilian safety. I'm ashamed I listened to her lies." But the meeting's most powerful moment came when Sarah addressed the community about our family's experience and the broader implications for military family protection. Sarah walked to the front of the room carrying the documentation that had built our federal case, months of evidence that had transformed neighborhood harassment into precedent-setting civil rights prosecution. Margaret Thornfield thought military families were easy targets because we move frequently and don't always have deep community roots. She thought we wouldn't fight back against systematic harassment and discrimination. Sarah's voice strengthened as she continued. But Margaret made a critical mistake. She targeted a federal court clerk who works with prosecutors daily and understands civil rights law. She thought federal employment made us vulnerable. Actually, it gave us access to legal protections she never imagined. The community's response was immediate and supportive. Sustained applause filled the room as neighbors showed respect for our family's fight against discrimination and support for military families generally. Attorney Kim's conclusion made Margaret's defeat complete. Margaret Thornfield will serve 12 to 15 years in federal prison for systematic civil rights violations. She'll pay $89,000 in restitution to military families she victimized. She's banned permanently from any HOA positions. The meeting's final element was community commitment to preventing future discrimination. Colonel Hayes announced that Aberdeen Proving Ground would provide annual SCRA training to all civilian housing developments near base installations. Commissioner Davis pledged county support for military families facing civilian harassment. This county honors military service. We will not tolerate discrimination against people who defend our freedom. The new HOA board, elected after Margaret's arrest, implemented policies specifically protecting military families and federal employees. Sarah was elected treasurer, bringing federal law expertise to community management. As residents filed out of the community center, the transformation was visible. Margaret's empty chair at the former HOA table represented the end of systematic harassment and the beginning of genuine military-civilian community partnership. Margaret Thornfield's harassment campaign had united our community in support of military families and created lasting protections against future discrimination. Sometimes justice doesn't come from dramatic confrontations. It comes from methodical application of federal law that protects people who serve America from civilians who think military service makes families vulnerable rather than protected. 6 months after Margaret Thornfield's conviction, our community had transformed from a place of military family harassment into a model for civilian-military cooperation that Aberdeen Proving Ground now showcases to other installations. Margaret's sentencing was swift and decisive. Federal Judge Michael Torres reviewed the evidence of systematic civil rights violations, bias-motivated crimes, and false reporting targeting military families, then delivered a sentence that sent a clear message: 14 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution. Ms. Thornfield, Judge Torres stated, you used your position of community authority to systematically harass military families because of their service to our nation. This court will not tolerate discrimination against people who defend our freedom. The financial consequences were equally devastating. Margaret was ordered to pay $89,000 to the 7 military families she'd victimized across 4 states, plus legal fees and punitive damages. Her house went into immediate foreclosure, and the property was purchased by a military family with help from Aberdeen Proving Grounds Housing Assistance Program. The irony was perfect. Margaret's former home now houses the very type of family she'd tried to drive out of civilian communities. Our neighborhood's transformation was remarkable. The new HOA board, led by Mrs. Patterson as president and Sarah as treasurer, implemented policies specifically protecting military families and federal employees under SCRA and Fair Housing Act requirements. Emma, now 7 and thriving, occasionally asks about the mean lady who went to jail, but her questions come from curiosity rather than trauma. She's learned that sometimes bad people target military families, but federal law protects service members when they know their rights. The community garden where Emma plays with neighborhood children was built using restitution money from Margaret's conviction. A small plaque reads, Meadowbrook Gardens Military Family Memorial Garden, honoring service members and their families. Sarah's federal court career benefited significantly from our experience. Her systematic documentation of civil rights violations became training material for federal prosecutors handling discrimination cases. She was promoted to supervisory court clerk and now teaches other federal employees how to recognize and document harassment. My military service took on new meaning after watching federal law protect our family. I was assigned to develop Aberdeen Proving Grounds Community Relations Program, helping other military families understand their SCRA rights and coordinate with civilian authorities when harassment occurs. The broader impact extended throughout Maryland and surrounding states. Our case prompted congressional review of civilian harassment of military families, resulting in enhanced federal funding for military legal assistance and clearer prosecution guidelines for SCRA violations. Base legal assistance offices at 12 installations now use our case as training material, showing military families exactly how to document harassment and invoke federal protections. Margaret's systematic targeting became the perfect example of what SCRA prevents and how federal law protects service members. The annual Meadowbrook Gardens Community Festival now includes military family appreciation events and SCRA education booths. Aberdeen Proving Ground provides speakers who explain military family rights and civilian community benefits from supporting service members. Margaret's story spread throughout HOA networks as a cautionary tale about the consequences of discriminating against military families. Property management companies began implementing specific training about SCRA requirements and federal penalties for violating military family rights. Emma starts 3rd grade next month at a school where military children are celebrated rather than targeted. She's proud that her family helped protect other military families from bullies like Margaret, and she understands that service to country includes serving community. Sarah and I often reflect on how federal law enforcement transformed our harassment nightmare into precedent-setting protection for military families. Margaret thought she was targeting vulnerable victims, but she actually chose the wrong family at the perfect time to create lasting change. Our message to other military families facing harassment is simple. Document everything, understand your SURA rights, contact base legal assistance immediately, and never underestimate federal law's power to protect people who serve America. Margaret Thornfield thought military service made families easy targets for civilian harassment. She learned from a federal prison cell that military families have institutional protection she never imagined. Federal law doesn't just exist on paper. It actively protects military families when they know how to use it. SURA isn't just legal theory. It's practical protection that works when service members understand their rights and document harassment systematically. Sometimes justice takes time, but federal law eventually protects people who protect America. Margaret's 14-year sentence proves that discriminating against military families carries consequences that destroy lives permanently. The Service Members Civil Relief Act exists for exactly this purpose, and it works when military families know how to use it.